show before. He writes for the Detroit News, does a great job covering Michigan State, and there's been a lot to cover. We focus on football on the other show typically, but I got to cover some football with him because we've been rotating in our Spartans coverage with not really knowing what was going to happen with that coaching situation, and now we've had a resolution there, and so now there's a lot of emphasis on that. But man, I don't want to overshadow this basketball team either, Connor, because they have been very good, and so part of me wanted to start with football, but I think we should start with basketball because they've played their way into the first segment here.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, they've been pretty strong as of late. A couple messier games. The Duke loss, I think, is one that stings for them because it was very much in their grasp and could have won that game. Obviously, a lead at halftime, and then things fell apart when Duke switched to zone. But a clunky loss on the road at Penn State. But given that place is a church in some ways, it's a little awkward to play there. And also, I think anytime you miss, a dozen layups, those things tend to bite you. So, no, Michigan State's in a really good spot. Point guard Jeremy Fears is probably one of the best passers in the country. I mean, he's leading the nation in assists, but he's also had some that, poor shooting has maybe wiped off the slate. Jackson Kohler's almost averaging a double-double. So they got a lot of depth, they got a good rotation, and they've been pretty fun to watch so far.
Even in that loss, they still, I feel like they fared pretty well because, like you said, they really didn't play their best game for playing. And granted, yeah, you're playing at Duke, and it's a tough, it's a very tough opponent. I mean, Boozer is going to be the guy to follow. He looks like the early favorite to be the number one pick. They've got two Boozer brothers there, by the way. The younger one looks good as well, and they've got a ton of other talent, but I thought with how Michigan State played, it gave them, say those two teams had to meet up again and they were both one seeds or what have you in the tournament, and then they eventually had to have a rematch in the Final Four. They had a little bit of a blueprint to win that game because the Boozer is so dominant for a lot of reasons. He's a big guy that can do pretty much everything, but they have a lot of depth and a lot of force up front. But Michigan State's able to match that, and I think that's one of their strengths when I see them match up against all these other teams, because that front line between Kohler, who, like you said, is a double-double machine but can go outside, Cooper, who's developing his skill set, and then you slot in Cohen Carr as a small forward who I think on a lot of teams wouldn't necessarily play small forward, but that's a great, formidable front line with some depth pieces too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think too, like the sorts of, you have a bad night against a team like Duke. Like, I think there's value in losing to a good team like that. Obviously, any team wants to win those games, and I think there's more value in a win, as we saw against Kentucky and North Carolina and Arkansas earlier in the year. But learning where the limitations are, learning where areas that a team needs to get better. I think there's value in that, and also seeing, how everything stacks up and the pace of play against a team that I think is probably going to be hanging banners of some sort at the end of the season in Duke. I mean, that's a really good team, obviously very talented, well coached, defensively, one of the better teams I've seen all year, and I know they've played some pretty tough teams as well in the schedule. So I've had a lot of people get on me about my AP ballots the past couple of weeks, but I really put a lot of stock into strength of schedule and, who wins are. And even sometimes the losses too, if you're losing to a team like that versus beating, a smaller mid-major or low-major opponent, I think there's a lot of value in those sort of top-ranked games. And that's why I really like the schedule that Tom put together is, you have those 4 ranked matches at the start of the season, and then going into a pretty tough Big Ten slate that, I think is going to be a war for a lot of teams. So it should be a really, really fun basketball season, and it's only just yet getting underway.
It's a classic Izzo pre-Big Ten schedule here, and I think if at the beginning of the season you said, hey, they're going to be 9-1 in their first 10 games, I think most people would have taken that, because you're going to see that obviously Duke was probably the most likely to lose to, but like you said, they've had a lot of very tough matchups in there, and they fared very well with those, and in the loss they didn't look bad, as I mentioned, but I think they've also kind of hit on something here too. I'm curious to get your thoughts, because the position that has been by far the most in flux, because we talked about the front court a little bit and how strong they are. You talked about Fears and how strong he is, and he just continues to develop. The one, not necessarily, I don't want to say hole, but the one missing link was the 2 spot, the off guard spot. And as the season was kind of developing, I was thinking, okay, I can see some of these guys as potential pieces. And it was like one guy played decently well, at least on a given night, and that was kind of occupying that off guard wingman kind of slot. And so sometimes it'd be Fort, sometimes it'd be, Kurt Tang would have a game, Scott would look good. But I didn't really envision them going to the lineup that they had recently with Ogochukwu as the 2 guard. And obviously that went pretty well, I would say, much above, I think, anybody's reasonable expectation.
Yeah, I think the big question there is just the rotation. Devine is a good scorer. Defensively still has some work to do. That was a problem at Miami as well, but when he was brought in, they sort of thought they could work in those areas of his game. And, he had obviously was a late portal ad as well, given that Jace Richardson declared and they were keeping a spot and all that. But that went about as well as they could in terms of roster construction to get a guy like Devine. But I think it's going to be about how the rotation responds. I think we saw some clear, maybe an adjustment to the level of play from Denim Wojcic. He did not look his best, and he's only really played kind of piecemeal minutes late in games here and there through the first 9 games. So doing that at Penn State, I think, was a big adjustment for him, and I don't think he quite answered that test, or maybe, I would probably give him like a C+ at best, and that's being really generous to him in that role. So I think they're going to have to figure out if they're going to play Devine at the 2, who's going to be that backup point guard when someone needs a breather. Because, when they subbed him and Fears off alternately and tried to keep someone on, it didn't have as much of a flow. And obviously Wojcic being in there a little bit, felt like it might be a little bit of this Penn State team is pretty beatable, so let's see what we can do. I think that might have been the mentality, just to get some live reps and see how guys respond when the bullets are flying, I guess. But it is sort of a precarious situation, right? Because there's 4 guys you would say that can fill in pretty adequately at that position. I mean, Kurt Tang is a decent enough shooter that has some defensive problems that he's working through, and I think it's also a size thing there. Trey Fort, offensively, I don't think he's ever seen a shot he didn't think he could take, but he also defensively kind of gets lost here and there. And then Jordan Scott is sort of the dark horse, I think, to take that role. Freshman wing from the DMV area, who just does all the little things right, and every teammate at Michigan State, I think, really, really likes him, and all they want to see him do is shoot, and he's almost too nice where he won't do it, and loves to pass and set up his teammates and just go be scrappy for the rebound. But he's slowly getting his shot together. Back-to-back games, he's had 2 threes, looks pretty good in against Duke. So I think that's something to monitor going forward, is what role he could play as well.
You basically answered my next question, which was going to be, how do you see that going forward? Because one of the main reasons you highlighted it, one of the main reasons I didn't see them going with Ugochukwu is because he fills a very valuable role once he stepped up to kind of seeing that he could do that backup point guard role. Because, I mean, Fears is very important, but you've got to let him get his minutes off the court too, especially with how much volume he has, how much usage he has. So you've got to have a valuable backup. He's done well in that position, and then to see him do so well as the off guard was like, okay, does this play him on? I'm more on your side. That's what I was going to ask you, is who you could see as that shooting guard if they don't go with Ugochukwu and they keep him slotted into kind of that maybe a hybrid role, but that backup point guard role. I think it's got to be Scott, because if you're looking at kind of the natural progression, those other guys have a little bit more under their belt. Tang is still pretty young. Fort's been around, but the idea that the development under an Izzo team and getting minutes as a young guy, having the faith of your teammates and seeing what we've been seeing. I wonder if it's going to be something where he eventually I think the ideal situation is he becomes a strong enough starter. And maybe, depending on how the game flow is going, maybe that means that Ugochukwu is part of your closing unit, where that you can then burn both of those guys at the same time if you need to do that. And obviously that depends on what happens throughout the game and who's hot and all of that. But the game isn't always about who's the starting five. It's often about who's the ending five, because teams often have a valuable six man that's going to close the game, and you know that one starter isn't going to close it out. But these are all good problems to have, because you can see already that through 10 games, okay, yeah, there's some potential emerging. That, not that I'm comparing any of these guys to Jace Richardson, but at game 10, Jace Richardson was a lot different than, game 25 Jace Richardson.
Yeah, and I think there's a similarity to how Jace sort of rose as a starter last year and fixed a lot of the problems for last year's starting lineup. You can move Jaden Akins to the 3. You can do a lot of things where, it was a similar transfer problem, right? Frankie Fiddler came in and wasn't quite the guy I think Michigan State expected him to be from Omaha, and eventually they solved that. But I think there's a parallel there. I think Jordan Scott's probably the best option they have there for what the rest of the rotation can do, because I think if you start him there, you don't have to ride him for 10 minutes or something like that. Just get him started. You can sub Divine in, or you can even move him to get Cohen Carr a rest as well, depending on how he's doing. I know he's had a bit of a slower start. He's had a few good games, but maybe the inconsistency has been there in the past 3 or 4. But and he's obviously dealing with some wear and tear and guys sort of hacking on him a little bit because of the dynamic threat he poses. But the way they can work that part of the rotation and get a few different looks. I mean, their front court I think is mostly set, especially at the 4 and 5. I think Carson Cooper, Cam Ward, and Jackson Kohler can give you kind of all the minutes you need. And Jesse McCullough's shown some good things in impact spots here and there. I think he might play fewer and fewer minutes down the stretch, just because he looks a little bit raw still. But I think how they sort of address the two is going to sort of dictate the rest of what the rotation is going to look like. And yeah, I think Divine would be good in a closing scenario if they're down. I wouldn't sleep on how Scott can play defensively, though. I think if they need to close out a game, and I think we saw this against Duke, even if they didn't really close that out and sort of fell apart down the stretch, but some of their best minutes were with Scott out there with Fears and sort of the defensive challenges that he poses with his length.
I agree. I think it depends on the need, which is nice that you have different people that can fit those different needs. And there were two more names that I wanted to hit on before we were done, and you hit on both of them, because Ward and McCullough have both looked good in their roles too, and I think could develop as the season goes on. So I think the future looks bright for them here, and I'll look forward to covering them throughout the season with you and others here. But we're going to take a quick break and then probably come back with some football, because I got to get your takes on the football side too, because that's another part where there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of restored hope. It went from the team being fairly I feel like the mood was fairly down in East Lansing, and it seems like it's improved in a hurry. So I want to get your take on that transition and how things are going thus far. But stick with us. You're listening to Sports Intel on Jethro FM.
From the Scully Statewide Moving Studios.
Country with a twist. Jethro FM. 1530 AM. WYGR Wyoming Grand Rapids. 94.9 FM Grand Rapids. 99.5 FM Lowell. And Jethro South. 980 AM WAKV Otsego Plainwell. 98.9 FM Otsego. And 105.1 FM Kalamazoo. Available worldwide at jethro.fm.
Coming back here with Connor Earegood of the Detroit News, talking some Spartans here. Talked about the basketball team, which it could deserve 2 segments on its own here, and we'll be covering them as the season goes on. But got to talk a little football with you here, Connor, because I know I've covered the Spartans a decent amount over the course of the year because I really thought that this year could have gone differently. Obviously, that's not the case, and there's a lot of things that could go differently, and you can't really explore the butterfly effect too effectively. But Smith, there's a lot of things that could have gone different, but it went from a lot of hope to hopeless pretty quickly, it seemed like, from the fan base standpoint. And then that flipped around pretty quickly again. It seemed, and I'm curious to get your take of kind of the temperature in the area there, covering the beat, because it's just flip-flopped where now they were kind of, I was a little concerned about them getting into the coaching carousel so late because there was a lot of movement, but they seemed to have gotten their guy. They seemed to know who they were going after and be well positioned for that. But I'm curious to kind of get your take on how that all went and how people are feeling now, because there seems to be a lot of juice with some of the former players that I know and alumni and the fan base here.
Yeah, I mean, they got their top choice. Like, anytime you can do that, no matter when you jump in the pool, I think that's always a win. And, I heard Pat Fitzgerald's name float around a little bit as soon as that UCLA loss hit. And sort of after that, I think was when that, you mentioned the hopeless, sort of listless effect. I think that's when that sort of hit, was after the UCLA game. That was the first one where it wasn't a sort of team that could overmatch them in some aspects, that still walked away. I mean, it was an interim coach leading them after Deshaun Foster was fired. So, Jonathan was always fun to cover. Never really, not to say coaches lie, but he never played like the media games or anything like that. He'd just tell you what he knew, and usually was pretty sound in some reasoning. I think there's some play calls and decision making. Punting to Caden Weegan in the Iowa game, I'll never understand, but it just didn't work out at Michigan State for him. And I think all parties involved sort of realized that. I've never seen a coach get fired and the athletic director, president, and successor all say, really nice things about the coach. And people tend to speak well about people who they're moving on from, right? You don't want to, kick someone while they're down and after you fire them. But I think Smith did a lot of good things for the roster construction of this program, but ultimately he couldn't win, and that's what people want to see. And I think that's what sort of the message is with Pat Fitzgerald. 14th all-time in Big Ten wins in the history of the conference. Obviously, that happened at Northwestern, where it's kind of hard to win. And I think we're sort of seeing that David Braun isn't exactly, winning 8-9 games like some of the seasons that Pat Fitzgerald had. And obviously his final two seasons were sort of not even middling, pretty bad. He was 4-20 in those final two seasons at Northwestern, and then the scandal hit. So I think there's a lot of promise for what he can bring to this team, and especially defensively, being a linebacker, being able to coach that side of the ball a little better than I think we saw with Smith. He brought in Max Bulla, who's a two-time captain at Michigan State, and revered sort of player. Joe Rossi's coming back, and I think that Joe Rossi's a good defensive coordinator that was sort of limited in his roster and who he could use, and some of the decisions there, and also didn't have much in the way of complementary football. So there's a lot to be excited about for Michigan State football. It's only just getting underway. The staff's still getting together. The roster is going to change here, but so far so good from that sort of perspective.
That's why the timing is so important with this, because when I say they got into the coaching carousel late, it's not even just the coaching carousel now. It's being able to manage the whole NIL thing, transfer portal, recruiting, all of that stuff. The timing has changed so drastically in the last couple of years and is continuing to change that I was kind of amazed how well Fitzgerald was able to do, and I think he was even hoarse in the press conference, and who could blame him, because he was probably on the phone from the minute he was hired, not only doing the press conferences that he needed to and talking to the people within the building, but that then minute number one, once you sign the deal, becomes okay. You get and hang on to who you can here, because we're building the roster right now.
Yeah, and I think the delayed transfer portal coming in January, and there's a window that opens when there's a new coach hired for players to leave, but I think that delay is going to help that he can get his staff together. He can sort of get things situated. Jonathan Smith, if you remember 2 years ago, sort of had to scramble to get everything together. I mean, in 2 weeks, he pretty much had his staff set, was hitting guys up in the portal, brought some with him from Oregon State. But I think the way things have, there's always the business behind the scenes, right? And when there's agents involved and, there's people reaching out during seasons to sort of recruit guys, that's a problem in all of college sports, but especially in football. There's always some issues to deal with there. But I think the slower clock, I guess, if you will, of what the offseason is going to look like this year, that some of the rules passed and changed the dynamic of, I think he can benefit from those a lot. And one thing I've noticed, too, is that he is very good at energizing people, especially donors. He's a guy that there's a lot of hope behind. And the product on the field and the wins are what's going to ultimately dictate if people believe in that for a long-term perspective. But he's a guy who's been able to win with less. And I think where Michigan State is at, obviously it's an athletic department that has its debts and is sort of digging out of those. It can't flaunt and wield money like an Ohio State or a Michigan or an Oregon or even, I mentioned Ohio State, but some of these SEC schools, for example. It understands its resources, and it's, I think, trying to increase those, and they've obviously added Spartan Ventures, which is their third-party capital sort of investment firm that they're starting up, and it's going to deal with a lot of media rights and NIL. But the way that they've approached that and sort of used this Fitzgerald hire to spark some of the interest there and get some people on board, I think there's been a bit of a shift with how people are looking at Michigan State in the Big Ten and sort of where their resources can lie.
It'll be interesting to follow here because, you hit it on the head with the fact that their main successful route as far as the football program is typically a guy that can come in and elevate kind of, I don't want to say middling because that sounds too discriminatory, but basically talent that is maybe undervalued and then getting the maximum out of kind of, maybe the 3-star range kind of recruits because there's a lot of money being thrown around. And like you said, it's hard to play in that end of the pool unless you're really armed properly. And they've got a lot of other financial issues that they've got to attend to with what you're talking about them addressing, but they've proven that they can do that in the past as far as identify some talent that works well for their culture and what they're building. They're bringing in some of the former players like Bola, who seems like a good tie to Fitzgerald there. So I thought that was a smart hire. Like you said, both former linebackers. So it'll be an exciting team to follow, both sides. And we'll look forward to having you back on, especially hopefully by the end of the basketball season, because I expect it to be a long season for him here. But we'll be following your coverage either way in between, and make sure to tell people where they can follow you here.
Yeah, DetroitNews.com/sports. You'll see all of our coverage, but Michigan State included. On Twitter, it's at Connor Earegood, ConnorEaregood. Thanks for having me on anytime.
Definitely. Happy to have you on. Glad you could join us and appreciate the coverage, and we'll look forward to having you on again soon here.
Excellent.
Thanks, Connor.